Ready for a deep dive into the 2024 Canadian budget. We're going beyond the headlines and focusing on how this budget impacts Indigenous communities. And let me tell you, there are some big numbers involved, like billions big. Since 2015, we've seen a massive change in how Canada invests in Indigenous priorities.
It's a pretty remarkable shift. We're talking about going from $11 billion in 2015-16 to a whopping $76 billion in 2022-23.
Wow, okay. That's a huge jump. So where is all of this money going?
Well, a significant chunk of that increase is dedicated to settling Indigenous claims and addressing past harms. It's about righting historical wrongs.
That makes sense. It's not just about throwing money at the problem, though, right? It's about changing the approach, too.
Absolutely. This budget is all about working directly with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities to find solutions that actually work for them. It's what we call a distinctions-based approach.
Distinctions-based meaning.
It recognizes that every Indigenous community has its own unique needs and priorities. One size doesn't fit all.
Right, of course. So what kind of impact is this new approach having? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Absolutely. Remember when there were only a dozen mental wellness teams trying to serve hundreds of Indigenous communities?
Yeah, it was barely scratching the surface.
Now, with this targeted funding, we're up to 75 teams serving over 385 communities.
Okay, that's a significant improvement.
And that's just one example. Take Sturgeon Lake First Nation. They just celebrated their first midwife-assisted birth in 50 years. They're even breaking ground on their own birthing center.
Wow, that's amazing.
And get this, 10 First Nations and Inuit communities now have their own laws for child and family services. They have the power to decide what's best for their kids.
That's huge. Talk about putting control back in the hands of the communities. Okay, I'm already seeing some real progress here. But let's get into the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about where exactly this money is going. One of the key areas in the budget is called investing in a brighter future.
It's all about setting up future generations for success. This category includes education, youth programs, cultural support, things that empower Indigenous youth to thrive.
Right, laying that foundation early on. So how much are we talking about here? What's the budget allocation for this?
Budget 2024 has allocated a substantial $1.194 billion for First Nation K-12 education.
Over $1 billion. That's huge.
It's a big step toward closing the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students.
Definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
But it's not just about the buildings, right? It's about what's happening inside them, too.
Exactly. And that's why this budget also supports Indigenous-led organizations that are doing amazing work with young people. Take Indigenous Youth Roots, for example. They're receiving $12.5 million to support their work fostering leadership and reconciliation.
Fantastic. So investing in the people and organizations that are making a real difference on the ground.
That's the idea. And then there's the Dichinta Center for Research and Learning up north. They're getting $5.2 million to support Indigenous students pursuing higher education.
Providing those opportunities for advanced learning. It's great to see that support extending beyond the K-12 level. Now, another key area in the budget is focused on advancing Indigenous self-determination, which that sounds like a pretty important one.
It's about giving Indigenous communities more autonomy and control over their own affairs. One way the budget does this is by providing funding for Section 35 negotiations. We're talking about $96.4 million.
Okay, for those of us who might not be familiar with legal jargon, what exactly are Section 35 negotiations?
You got it. Sorry. Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution recognizes Aboriginal and treaty rights. These negotiations are about making sure Indigenous communities have a real say in how their land, resources, and governance are managed.
So it's about shifting the power dynamics, moving away from that top-down approach and toward a more equitable partnership.
Exactly. And it's not just about having a seat at the table. It's about having the resources to actually act on those decisions. That's where the opt-in fact sales tax framework comes in.
FACT. Now, there's an acronym I haven't heard before. What does that stand for?
It stands for fuel, alcohol, cannabis, tobacco, and vaping.
Ah, okay. So is this about giving Indigenous governments more control over taxation?
Exactly. It allows them to generate revenue and fund their own priorities. This is a big deal because it gives communities more financial independence.
It sounds like this budget is taking some important steps towards empowering Indigenous communities to chart their own course.
It's a big step, for sure. But, we've got to remember, these budget lines, they're really just the tip of the iceberg.
Right. It's like we're looking at the ingredients list, but not the actual recipe. How do we take all of this and make sure it translates into real change on the ground?
You hit the nail on the head. That's the real challenge and the exciting part, really. When we go beyond just the numbers and look at the bigger picture, there's a clear shift happening.
You're talking about that move towards a more distinctions-based, indigenous-led approach we were discussing earlier.
Exactly. This budget, it's not just about writing checks, it's about changing the relationship. It's about recognizing the inherent right of Indigenous communities to self-determination.
So it's about action, not just words. What are some concrete things that need to happen to make sure these investments have the impact we're hoping for?
Oh, we've got to start by acknowledging that reconciliation, it's not a destination, it's a journey, right?
I like that. It's a process, not an endpoint.
And like any journey, it's going to have its twists and turns, its ups and downs. But I think one of the most important things is making sure that Indigenous voices are front and center, leading the way.
So where do we go from here? What are the key areas we need to focus on to make sure these investments are truly transformative?
Education, for one. We can't overstate the importance of investing in education. That $1.194 billion for First Nation K-12 education, that's a game changer. But it's just the first step.
Right. It's not just about funding. It's about making sure those schools are meeting the needs of Indigenous students.
Exactly. We need culturally relevant curricula. We need to support Indigenous teachers. And we need to address the systemic barriers that prevent Indigenous students from reaching their full potential.
And we need to make sure those educational opportunities lead to real economic opportunities.
You got it. The Indigenous Loan Guarantee Program, that's a fantastic initiative. $5 billion. That's a serious commitment.
It is. And it has the potential to be truly transformative. But how do we make sure it reaches the communities that need it most?
That's the key, isn't it? We need to make sure Indigenous communities have the information and support they need to access that funding. And we need to create an economic environment where Indigenous businesses can thrive.
And let's not forget about the basics: healthcare, housing, social support. These are the foundations of a healthy community.
Absolutely. And the investments in this budget, they're significant. $918 million for housing, $213.5 million for income support for persons with disabilities living on reserve. That's huge.
It is.
Yeah.
But again, it's about more than just the money. It's about making sure those services are culturally safe, accessible, and responsive to the needs of the community.
And it's about addressing the root causes of these disparities. The legacy of colonialism, systemic racism, these are things we need to confront head on.
This budget takes some important steps, but it's clear that true reconciliation requires ongoing commitment and action from all of us.
Couldn't agree more. It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about challenging our own biases and assumptions.
It's about listening to and learning from Indigenous peoples. It's about recognizing that reconciliation is not just a policy. It's a responsibility we all share.
It's about building a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
It really feels like this budget is trying to shift the narrative.
Yeah.
It's acknowledging the deep injustices of the past and taking concrete steps to address them.
Yeah, it's about more than just acknowledging, it's about action. And it's about recognizing that Indigenous peoples aren't just one group among many, they're the original rights holders in this country.
And this budget, it feels like a step toward honoring those rights, wouldn't you say? Towards building a more just and equitable Canada for everyone.
I'd agree with that. It's a step in the right direction, for sure. But it's just that, a step. There's still a lot of work to be done.
And that's why these conversations, these deep dives are so important. It's not just about understanding the budget itself. It's about sparking a broader dialogue about what reconciliation really means.
Exactly. This budget, it's a roadmap, not a destination.
I like that. It lays out a path, but it's up to all of us to actually walk it.
And that means asking ourselves some tough questions, challenging our own biases, being willing to have those uncomfortable conversations.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Canadian 2024 budget, I want to leave our listeners with a call to action. What can we all do in our own lives to contribute to reconciliation?
Well, for starters, educate yourself. Learn about the history and cultures of the Indigenous peoples in your area.
Right. Support Indigenous-led organizations. Seek out Indigenous businesses.
And don't be afraid to have those tough conversations with your friends and family, because reconciliation, it's not just a government policy, it's a shared responsibility.
It's about building relationships, right? Based on respect and understanding. And a genuine desire to create a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Exactly. And that starts with each and every one of us.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Canadian 2024 budget. We'll continue to follow these issues closely and keep you updated on the progress being made and the challenges that still lie ahead.
It's an ongoing conversation, and we all have a role to play.
Absolutely. Thanks again for listening, everyone. Until next time.